Ian Bremmer, I'm very curious to know what you think about a comment made by someone you know well, Borge Brande, the president of the World Economic Forum. He was at the Business Today India at 100 Summit recently, and in an interview I did with him, he said that in the next 10 years, the Indian economy will be $10 trillion, and he sees the emergence of a new world order, which will be defined by what he called the G3, the US, China, and India. Now, your book is G0, which is about each country pulling for itself. And in that context, I wonder what you think of Borge Brande's comments about a G3.
Well, I'll get to that. I want to quickly offer a rejoinder to what my friend Kishore was just saying, which is that, of course, we don't want to simplify the Chinese economy, but we do want to go back to what Secretary Raimondo just said in another year, 2 years, 3 years, about how many people believe that China is increasingly uninvestable because Chinese labor, remember, the last 40 years of extraordinary Chinese growth came because China had unprecedented, inexpensive, productive labor that was essential. It became the factory of the world. That is no longer the case. Chinese labor is more expensive than Mexican labor today, in part because of the extraordinary growth. Chinese domestic competition is much more challenging in a legal environment that is not markedly more open. That's making Western firms less interested. And the Chinese demographic situation is appallingly bad for a middle-income country. I mean, you imagine it in South Korea or Japan, but not for a country that's only making $12,000 per capita. So all of these things are going to make China more challenging in terms of their growth story for the next 3, 5, 10 years, even if the U.S.-China relationship remains relatively calm and steady. And that is a big assumption going forward. So I am more concerned than I have been for a long term for where China is going. That does play into my view of whether or not we're heading into a G3. I think the world is more complicated than that. We've been talking about the G20 on today's show, but of course, at the same time as the G20, which is the most important in the sense of being most inclusive among the largest countries out there, but the most impactful summits increasingly are the G7. And that's because the United States leads it. It is more cohesive. It is more coordinated. And these countries are increasingly sharing a worldview. That means that the BRICS, with China much more comfortable attending it, they're trying to make that a different order that has the Chinese and the global South together. And certainly I see an environment that's going to be much more complicated than G3. I see one where the Americans are dominating the security order that feels like a G1 still, with a bunch of rogues that don't participate. And I think the India-U.S. relationship and the new architecture in Asia around the Quad is a big piece of that. I think that economically, which is what Borge is talking about, there will probably be something that is more G3-like, but also with the EU as a principal player. I'm a little surprised that he didn't include the EU in that formulation, especially given where the WEF is headquartered, and because I see it as being more cohesive and coordinated over time, not less. But then there's a technology order, a digital order, and it's not clear that that's a G anything. It may well be a technopolar order where technology companies, not governments, are actually driving outcomes. And that's a dangerous geopolitical development. So, I mean, I don't think the G0 is going to persist for long, but I think what replaces it is a lot more nuanced and complex than the idea of a G3.
Samir Saran, everyone watching at this moment would be delighted with the idea that there's a G3 emerging, but then they'd advise caution and say, let's not get carried away by the hype, as India often tends to overpromise and underdeliver. In your reading of the situation, could Borge be right about the emergence in the next 10 years of a new world order defined by the G3? Or was he just pandering to the domestic Indian constituency, given that that's where he was speaking, which is why, as Ian mentioned, he left Europe out of that formulation?
The good thing about India, Rahul, is that you can make an assertion about India that is true, and the opposite is also equally true. So I think perhaps what we really need to be thinking about is the big question that Ian has posed before all of us. That could we have all of this, we still have a G0 world, because no one is really in control. And I think it's probably going to be a sectoral and domain-focused influence of different actors at different points of time. But collectively, are we still going to see what my book promises, a new world disorder? And I think that's the big question, that a G0 world and a G3 world are not contradictory. You could have a G0 world and still have 4 or 5 big countries with their influence operations in different domains and sectors. And I think we are probably going to see a kaleidoscope of all of that play out in the coming decade. I just want to reiterate one point. And I agree with Kishore. It's a complex country. It's not easy to make pronouncements, but Ian is right. An old China, an aging China, a China without sufficient people, with costly labor, is not the China of the previous 2.5 decades. And I think that's the story that's playing out in China. That can an aging China have the same resilience and resurgence that it has remarkably shown in its 4 decades of growth in the future? Can we project that into the future? And I think that's the big if. And to me, India is certainly a bright spot, contributing 15% of growth this year, 15% of global growth with a GDP that's close to 5% global GDP. So we are certainly a bright spot, but we require to be relentless in investing in infrastructure, industry, opening up, and making ourselves investable. So I think the India story which lies ahead is about continuously doing more, doing it better, doing it faster, and doing the simple things right. We don't have to be complex. We need the roads and the bridges and the ports and sensible laws, and we are there. But we need to do this with single-minded focus in the days ahead. We could be G3. We could certainly be part of any grouping that organizes the world in the future. EU is a big actor. EU will be a partner with India. Both of us don't want the G2 world. Both of us want a world where we should be able to make alignments based on interests and values and what suits us. So I think the EU is difficult to ignore and would be part of any formulation for the future.
Okay, so both Ian and Samir pushing back against Kishore Mehbubani's idea that China will bounce back, to say that the factors that propelled China's growth over the past 4 decades are different from the world internally and externally. An aging population, smaller workforce, the fact that with a China plus one pivot, a lot of companies now wanting to look outside China and build resilience in their value chains. And therefore, a lot of estimates now say that China may possibly never become the #1 economy. Even if it does, it will happen at a much later stage than was initially being predicted. Kishore Mehbubani, you've always been, especially from an Indian point of view, very soft on China and very tough on India.
Well, the #1, I would say that what makes me unusual is that I'm bullish on both India and China, and people often make a choice. Now, the story on China, all you have to do is go back and read what the Anglo-Saxon media told you 10 years ago about how the China story is over. It's a constant theme. It's a constant theme.
You don't think this time is different because of the factors that Ian just mentioned?
Well, there are answers to every one of the points you made. Now, let me give you a simple answer. Let me give you a simple answer. China is producing the largest number of robots in the world. The largest number. Now, that's clearly an answer that they saw a long time ago to the fact that the labor force is diminishing. China is also producing the largest number of graduates in STEM, science, technology, right? And China has surpassed everyone's expectations. When the United States cut off exploration on space with China, How did China perform? It set up its own international space station. I'm only saying this, by the way. If China performs as badly as Ian says it is going to perform, we have nothing to worry. China, the story is over. But what happens if my predictions come true? And we'll find out in 5 to 10 years. And China really becomes the #1 economy in the world, then it's a different world. And we have to psychologically consider what that kind of world is. And by the way, surprisingly, I agree with Ian Bremmer that it won't be a G3 world. It'll be a very complex world. There'll be many shapes and nuances, lots of players, including, by the way, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, including the African Union. And I can tell you Russia will play a role too. So it'll be a very complex world. And the simple black and white divisions that we make will no longer operate in the world. And I must say, the one thing I have to disagree with Ian Bremmer is about the G7. It's a sunset organization. It represents the past. It's a postcard from the past. People will laugh at the G7 10 years from now when they continue meeting. Come on, let's get serious. The world has changed fundamentally. You know, the reason why my book, The Asian 21st Century, has been downloaded 3.2 million times in 160 countries is because the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century, which includes India in a very big way.